Noah Hayes slammed his palm down on the registry desk so hard that the inkwell rattled, and the clerk stumbled backward into the wall of paper files, sending loose pages fluttering to the plank floor like startled doves. Every person in that narrow, wood-paneled room froze. The line of men waiting to register their claims and homestead papers stretched clear out the door and into the blazing June heat of Caldwell, Kansas, 1879, and every single one of them stared at the sheriff's granite jaw and the wildfire burning behind his dark eyes. "Her name," Noah said, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer strike, "gets added before anyone else today." The clerk, a thin man named Percival Dodge whose collar was perpetually too tight, pressed himself against the filing cabinet and went pale as fresh cream. His mouth worked soundlessly. The registry book lay open between them, ink still wet on the last entry, and beside it sat a single folded document that Noah had carried across 40 miles of open prairie without stopping to sleep or eat. "Sheriff Hayes," Percival managed, his voice climbing toward a squeak, "there are regulations. There is a proper order. These men have been waiting since before sunrise, and the Land Office Commissioner has specific rules about Percival." Noah's eyes did not move. They stayed fixed on the clerk with an intensity that had once made a wanted outlaw in Dodge City put down his weapon without being asked twice. "Open the book to a fresh line, pick up that pen, write the name Sadie Sullivan, and do it right now." The silence in the room stretched tight as a wire fence. Someone in the line outside coughed. A fly buzzed against the single dusty window. And then slowly, with the careful movements of a man diffusing a stick of dynamite, Percival Dodge reached for his pen. To understand why Noah Hayes would walk into that registry office with fire in his eyes and a woman's name on his lips, you had to go back 6 weeks, to a Tuesday afternoon in late April when the stagecoach from Wichita rolled into Caldwell with a broken wheel, and a passenger roster that would change everything about the quiet, carefully constructed life that Noah had built for himself in the years since the war. Caldwell in the spring of 1879 was a town balanced on the razor edge between civilization and wilderness. It sat at the very tip of the Kishom Trail, a place where the cattle drives from Texas ended and the long work of selling and shipping began. It was loud with cowboys, sharp with the smell of cattle and leather and gunpowder, and governed with an iron hand by the county commissioner, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had made a small fortune in land speculation, and who wore his power like a tailored suit, never letting anyone forget it was there. Whitmore had appointed Noah Hayes as sheriff 3 years ago because Noah had a reputation for order and restraint that was rare among men who carried badges in that part of Kansas, and because Whitmore believed Noah was the kind of man who could be controlled. Whitmore had been wrong about that second part, but he had not yet fully understood his mistake. Noah was 31 years old and built like the Kansas landscape itself, wide and solid and deceptively still, with the kind of quiet that held something underneath it. He had served in the Union Army as a young man, had seen enough of war to come out of it with a permanent gravity behind his eyes, and had drifted westward after Appomattox the way many veterans did, looking for space enough to breathe without the weight of what he had witnessed pressing in from all sides. He had found Caldwell and had made it his, not out of ambition but out of a bone-deep need to protect something, to be the steady hand between order and chaos, to stand in the gap and hold it. He was good at the work. He was scrupulously fair, and he was, in the particular and specific way of men who have been burned by war and loss, entirely, resolutely alone. He told himself he preferred it. He had become practiced at believing the story he told himself. The stagecoach broke its front wheel on the rut outside Harmon's General Store at 2:30 on a Tuesday, and the resulting crack of wood and the startled shout of the driver brought Noah out of his office at a controlled walk that was as close as he ever came to running in public. He was a sheriff. Running suggested panic. Noah Hayes did not panic. What he found at the scene was a coach tilted hard to one side, 4 passengers climbing carefully out of the listing door, and a driver swearing with considerable creativity at his lead horse. Noah helped the first passenger, an elderly minister with a white beard, step down from the tilted floor without falling. He steadied the second passenger, a cattle buyer from Wichita who was already more interested in looking for a saloon than in gratitude. The third passenger was a woman of perhaps 45, who took Noah's offered hand with the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being assisted. And then there was the fourth passenger. She came out of that tilted stagecoach door the way trouble always came into a man's life, which was to say, entirely without warning and at exactly the wrong moment. She was around 26, with dark auburn hair that the journey had pulled loose from its pins so that it curled against her neck in the afternoon heat, and she had green eyes the color of creek water in the shade of tall cottonwoods. She was dressed in practical traveling clothes, a dark blue dress that had seen considerable wear, and she carried a single leather satchel that appeared to contain everything she owned. She stepped down from the coach without waiting for Noah's hand, planted both feet on the dirt of the main street, and looked at Caldwell, Kansas, with the direct, assessing gaze of someone cataloging both its possibilities and its dangers in the same breath. She noticed Noah at approximately the same moment that he noticed he had been staring for too long. "Sheriff," she said, because the star on his chest made his identity obvious, and her voice was steady and clear, carrying none of the trembling uncertainty that sometimes marked women who arrived alone in frontier towns. "Is there somewhere in this town that takes in travelers? I need lodging and I need information about the homestead land north of town." Noah found his voice approximately 1 second after he found his professionalism. "Mrs. Calloway runs a boarding house on Maple Street," he said. $50 a night, meals included. As for the homestead land, you would want to speak with the land registry office. It is on 2nd Avenue. "Miss," she said. "It is Miss Sullivan, Sadie Sullivan." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder with a small, unconscious movement that spoke of long practice carrying it alone. "And thank you, Sheriff." She walked away from the wreck of the stagecoach and down the main street of Caldwell with her back straight and her chin up, and Noah Hayes watched her go with the particular, helpless attention of a man who has just felt the ground shift beneath his feet and is still catching up to what it means. He did not follow her. He went back to his office and wrote his incident report about the stagecoach wheel with the careful, methodical handwriting he used for everything, and he told himself he would not think about the green eyes or the steadiness of her voice or the way she had said her own name like she was daring him to discount it. He was very thorough in his not thinking. He thought about nothing else for the remainder of the afternoon. Sadie Sullivan had come to Caldwell with a plan that had taken her 2 years to construct, and every cent she had managed to save during those 2 years working as a schoolteacher in Wichita. The plan was precise and practical, because Sadie was a precise and practical woman who had learned very young that plans were what stood between a woman alone in the world and the various disasters that world was always ready to offer. The plan was this. Her father, James Sullivan, had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of grassland north of Caldwell in 1876, 3 years before his death from a fever the following spring. The land had been his dream, a piece of the frontier where he intended to build something permanent, something that would outlast him. He had died before he could work the land, and Sadie had inherited both the claim and the dream, and the stubborn, determined belief that she was going to make it real. The land office had sent her a letter in February informing her that her father's original claim needed to be renewed and confirmed under her own name before the end of June, or it would revert to the territory for redistribution. Sadie had read that letter 5 times, folded it carefully, and started saving with an urgency that bordered on desperation. She arrived in Caldwell with exactly the right amount of money for the renewal fee, plus a small reserve for supplies and the first weeks of establishing herself on the land, and she intended to walk into that registry office the very next morning and secure what was rightfully hers. She did not know, on that first Tuesday evening as she settled into Mrs. Calloway's clean, modest boarding house and ate her supper in the communal dining room, that Gerald Whitmore had already designated that specific piece of land for redistribution to one of his business associates. She did not know that Whitmore kept a meticulous record of valuable parcels and that her father's land, sitting on a natural water source and adjacent to the new railway survey, was exactly the kind of property he liked to redirect into friendly hands. She did not know any of this because she had been in Wichita, teaching school and saving pennies, not watching the political machinery of Caldwell's land office grind away at her inheritance. She found out the next morning at 9 o'clock when she walked through the door of the registry office and told Percival Dodge that she needed to renew the Sullivan homestead claim, number 1847B, and Percival Dodge had looked at her with an expression of professional, prepared regret, and told her that claim 1847B had been flagged for administrative review and could not be processed without the commissioner's explicit authorization. Sadie had stood very still at the desk for a long moment. She was good at being still when what she wanted to do was something entirely different. She asked, in a carefully level voice, what administrative review meant and how long it was expected to take. Percival told her he could not say. She asked when she could speak with the commissioner. Percival told her that Commissioner Whitmore was unavailable. She asked when he might become available. Percival told her he could not say. Sadie Sullivan thanked Percival Dodge with complete, icy courtesy and walked back out into the June sun and stood on the boardwalk outside the registry office and thought about what her next move should be. She thought about her father, who had believed in the orderly workings of honest institutions. She thought about 2 years of saving and scrimping and planning. She thought about the letter from the land office and whether it counted as legal proof of her claim's validity. And then she squared her shoulders, turned right, and walked toward the building with the star painted above the door, because if there was corruption happening in Caldwell's land office, the sheriff was the appropriate person to know about it. She arrived at Noah's office at 9:47 in the morning and knocked on the open door with 3 decisive knocks. Noah looked up from his desk. He registered her presence with an internal reaction he was careful not to let reach his face. She was carrying a leather satchel and a folded letter, and the particular expression of someone who has already thought through an argument from multiple angles. "Miss Sullivan," he said, and stood, because whatever else he was, Noah Hayes was a man who had been raised with certain courtesies that survived everything the world had subsequently thrown at him. "What can I do for you?" She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited to, which he noted and privately approved of, and she spread the folded letter on his desk with the same precision she might have used to lay out a legal brief. "You can tell me why the land office is blocking my father's homestead claim," she said, "and whether there is anything in Caldwell's regulations that actually permits them to do so." He read the letter carefully. He was the kind of man who read things carefully. When he finished, he looked up at her and she was watching him with those creekwater eyes and that expression of contained, controlled urgency, and something in his chest shifted in a way that he categorized as professional concern and moved briskly past. "Claim 1847B, he said. "That is the Sullivan land north of Millbrook Creek. You know it," she said, and there was a small, involuntary softening in her voice that suggested the land meant more to her than she was letting the surface of the conversation show. "I ride past it on my northern patrol route," he said. "It is good land. The water source makes it valuable." He set the letter down on his desk and looked at her directly. "It is also the kind of land that Commissioner Whitmore has a history of finding reasons to redirect." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a woman deciding how much to trust a man she had known for less than 24 hours. Noah understood it and waited inside it without trying to fill it. "Then you know he is corrupt," she said. "I know he is powerful," Noah said carefully, "and that the two are not always easy to separate in the absence of proof. What I know for certain is that your letter constitutes a valid legal notice of your intent to renew. What I know is that the land office does not have unlimited authority to delay a valid claim. And what I know is that the renewal deadline is 6 weeks from today." 5 weeks and 6 days, she said. I counted. Something moved in his expression that he had not entirely planned. It might have been the beginning of respect. "The land office opens for standard registry at 9 each morning," he said. "You should attempt to file each day. Denial creates a record. A record can be challenged." She picked up her letter and folded it back along its original creases with the same precision. "Have you ever challenged Commissioner Whitmore?" she asked, not accusingly, but with the directness of someone who needed accurate information. He hesitated for exactly 1 second. "Not successfully," he said. "Yet." She looked at him for a moment that stretched just past professional courtesy into something that neither of them named. Then she stood, tucked her letter into her satchel, and offered her hand across his desk. It was a businesslike gesture, one that said she was treating him as a colleague rather than a supplicant, and Noah shook it and felt the firm, warm steadiness of her grip, and thought about the word yet that had come out of his mouth, and whether he had meant it as seriously as it had sounded. He had. What followed was 5 weeks that changed Noah Hayes down to the root of whatever he had thought he was. It began professionally. He accompanied her to the land office on the 3rd morning when it became clear that Percival Dodge had been instructed to simply deny her each day with escalating bureaucratic obstruction. Noah stood beside the desk while Sadie filed her paperwork and asked her specific, informed questions, and his presence made Percival's denials slightly less brazen, which was something, though not enough. He spent evenings at his desk reviewing the territory's homestead regulations, with a thoroughness that he had not applied to legal documents since his brief and unsuccessful attempt at reading law before the war. He found 3 specific statutes that he believed Whitmore was violating. He wrote them down and gave the notes to Sadie, and she read them at the boarding house dining table with her untouched coffee going cold beside her and her pen making precise annotations in the margins. She came by his office on the 5th day with a counterbrief she had drafted herself, citing 2 of his 3 statutes plus a federal provision she had found in a copy of the 1862 Homestead Act that she had borrowed from the minister who had arrived on the same broken state coach. Noah read it and felt a quality of admiration that was entirely new in its particular texture. He was a man who respected competence above most things, and what Sadie Sullivan had constructed in that document was quietly, rigorously competent. "You could have been a lawyer," he said. "I was a school teacher," she said, accepting her document back. "Same fundamental skill. You explain the rules clearly enough that no one can pretend they do not understand them." It was also, he would later recognize, the moment he stopped being careful about how he looked at her. He was not reckless about it, he was not obvious. But somewhere in the next hour of their conversation, which ranged from the legal strategy to the practicalities of working a homestead alone, and then, sideways and almost accidentally, into a story she told about her father teaching her to identify the different grasses of the Kansas prairie when she was 9 years old, the professional distance he had been maintaining began to simply exist less. Like a fence whose posts had been quietly loosening in soft ground, and then one day you look and it is still standing, but it would not take much. They began to talk every day. It was practical. There was an ongoing situation requiring collaboration. Noah accompanied her to the registry, or checked in on what responses she had received, or updated her on his own investigations into Whitmore's history of land manipulation. They talked about the case. And then, in the way of people who share a daily habit and discover they want it to run longer, they talked about other things. She told him about the schoolroom in Wichita, about a particular student who had finally mastered reading at 10 years old after 2 years of patient work. And the pride in her voice was the honest, unperformed pride of a woman who knew what her work meant. He told her about a summer he had spent as a boy in the grasslands of Illinois before the war, before everything, when the prairie had seemed like it went on forever, and that had been a comfort rather than a loneliness. She understood why, exactly, without him having to explain. There was an afternoon in the second week when a drunk cowboy made a comment about Sadie as she crossed the main street that was specific enough in its ugliness to make two bystanders look away. Noah, who had been crossing from the opposite direction, reached the cowboy with a speed that was conversational in its calm, and told him quietly that he would spend the night in the jail if he said another word. The cowboy saw something in Noah's face that convinced him the jail was worth avoiding and moved along. Sadie, who had continued walking with that straight-backed, chin-up composure that Noah was beginning to understand was not indifference but armor, stopped at the boardwalk edge and turned back to look at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I was standing right there," he said. "Many men stand right there," she said, and looked at him with an expression that was complicated and then compressed itself back into something simpler. "Thank you, Noah." It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it the way you noticed a change in weather before you could say what specifically had changed. He said her name in return, Sadie, and watched her quick breath, and the way she turned away almost fast enough to hide the color that moved across her face. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening and told himself it was irrelevant and that the priority was the land claim, which was true and also not the entire truth. Gerald Whitmore was not a dramatic man. He was a patient one, which was more dangerous. He was 53, with the soft solidity of a man who had spent 20 years eating well and doing his violence through paperwork. He had arrived in Caldwell in 1869 with a modest investment and a thorough understanding of how frontier land speculation worked, and he had built a system over a decade that was difficult to challenge because it operated almost entirely within the letter of the law while disemboweling its spirit. He bought judges with dinners, not envelopes. He redirected land not through theft but through administrative delays and expired deadlines, and the kind of bureaucratic friction that most claimants could not afford to fight for long enough to win. He had seen Noah Hayes navigate the edges of his authority before. He had accommodated it because Noah was useful, because a reputation for honest law enforcement was good for Caldwell's growth, and Caldwell's growth was good for Whitmore's investments. But he had always known, the way a careful man knows a potential vulnerability in his perimeter, that Hayes was not wholly his man. He had hoped to never need to test it directly. The Sullivan claim forced the test into the open. Whitmore called Noah into his office at the end of the third week, from across a desk even more imposing than Noah's own, and explained with great patience and several misleading references to proper procedure that the Sullivan claim had complications that required time to resolve, and that the sheriff's repeated presence at the registry office was, while no doubt well-intentioned, creating a situation that the commissioner found professionally inconvenient. Noah sat across from that imposing desk and listened to the full explanation without interrupting, which Whitmore had always found both admirable and faintly unnerving, and then said, "Commissioner, I have reviewed the relevant statutes, and Miss Sullivan's claim meets every requirement for straightforward renewal. The delay is not legally supportable. I want you to know that I intend to continue assisting her." "That is a limited position for a man of your future prospects," Whitmore said, and there was a warmth in his tone that was made entirely of threat. "It is the position the law supports," Noah said, and stood and left. That same evening, he found Sadie on the porch of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, sitting in the wooden chair with a book open on her knee that she was not quite reading, watching the sky above the main street darken from amber to deep violet. The Caldwell evenings in June were extravagant with color, the sky wide and showing off, and Sadie was watching it with the look of someone who wants to memorize it in case it is the last chance. He sat in the other chair without asking, which was new, a small step across a line they had been approaching from different directions. She did not tell him it was presumptuous. She looked at him and then back at the sky and said, "Whitmore spoke to you today." "How did you know?" he said. "You walk differently when you have made a decision about something difficult," she said, slower, more deliberate. He looked at her profile in the evening light and thought about the fact that she had been watching him closely enough to learn how he walked in different circumstances. He thought about whether he ought to say something about that specifically. He decided to say something else instead. "My father was a farmer," he said. He lost his land in a debt negotiation that a different, better lawyer might have prevented. He worked someone else's soil for the rest of his life. He was a good man, and he never said one bitter word about it, and I never once heard him stop grieving. Sadie set her book face down on her knee. The last light was catching the copper in her hair and making it glow. She did not say anything for a moment, and when she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "My father used to say that land was a promise you made to the future," she said. "He said it was the only promise a man could make that outlasted his life. He chose that land north of Millbrook Creek because of the water and the grass, but also because standing on it, you can see about 15 miles in every direction, and he said that felt like being able to see clearly, which was what he always wanted most." Noah thought about the Sullivan land on his northern patrol, the way the prairie opened up from that slight elevation, and the grass went silver in the wind, and the creek caught the light. He thought about a man dying before he could stand on it and feel that clarity he had wanted. "I am going to make sure you get it," he said. She turned and looked at him directly, and the thing between them that they had not been naming was in the look, present and undeniable, and she said, "Noah," in a voice that was not a question and not an answer and was something more honest than either. "I mean it," he said. "Whatever it takes." "I know you do," she said. "That is exactly what concerns me." It was not the response he had expected, and he gave her the pause she deserved. "Concerns you," he said. "I have been alone and sufficient for a long time," she said, with a careful precision that he was beginning to recognize as her particular form of bravery, the kind that meant she was about to say something that cost her something. "I arrived here with a plan I made by myself, and I have survived harder things than Gerald Whitmore's paperwork. If I let myself depend on someone and that someone becomes unavailable," she stopped, started again. "I am not afraid of Whitmore. I am slightly afraid of how much I have come to rely on your company over the past 3 weeks, and I think you ought to know that because I think you are the kind of man who means what he says, and I would rather know where I stand." The porch was very quiet. Down the street, the saloon was producing its usual evening sounds, piano and voices, and the occasional burst of laughter. The stars were coming out one at a time in the darkening sky above Caldwell. "You stand," Noah said slowly, "in a position that I find myself thinking about throughout most of the hours of my day, including the hours I am supposed to be working. And I am a man who has been entirely comfortable with solitude for 10 years, so I think that tells you something about where you stand." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with a slight breathlessness that was very unlike her usual steadiness, "I think that tells me a great deal." He reached across the distance between the 2 porch chairs and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the book. She turned her hand so that their fingers were interlaced, and they sat there in the Caldwell evening watching the stars appear, holding on, neither one of them needing to say anything else about it because the thing between them had been named now, sufficiently if not completely, and it filled the porch like warmth from a fire. That was the beginning of what Whitmore later called Noah's mistake and Noah later called the clearest thing he had ever known. They had 2 weeks of it, which was enough to be transformative and not enough to be safe. Morning meetings at the Registry office, which continued to deny Sadie's claim through escalating invented complications. evenings on the boarding house porch or walking the outer edge of town where the prairie started, and the grass whispered in the evening wind. Sunday afternoons when Noah's duties were lighter, riding out to the Sullivan land north of Millbrook Creek, so that Sadie could walk her future acres and measure them against the dream her father had given her, and so that Noah could watch her face when she stood on the high ground and looked out 15 miles in every direction, and breathed differently than she breathed in town. He kissed her there the first time, on a Sunday afternoon in the 5th week, with the June wind moving the grass around them and the creek shining below, and the sky so enormous above that Caldwell and Whitmore, and the whole grinding machinery of trouble felt temporarily very small. She kissed him back with her whole heart, the way she did everything, without halfway measures, and he understood then with the specific certainty of a man who has learned to recognize true things that this was not something he was willing to lose. Which brought him, on the morning of June the 14th, to the point of crisis. He found the notice tacked to the door of the registry office before Sadie arrived. It was a single-page, official letterhead, signed by Commissioner Whitmore, informing the public that Claim 1847B, the Sullivan homestead, had been formally determined to have lapsed due to 3 years of non-occupation since its original filing, and was hereby released for redistribution effective June the 16th. 2 days away. Noah stood on the boardwalk reading that notice with the careful, complete attention of a man reading a verdict, and when he finished, he looked at the date and at the 2 days remaining and at the signature at the bottom, and every quiet thing in him went very still and very decided. He had investigated Whitmore for weeks. He had the statutes. He had Sadie's documented attempts to file, each one recorded and dated. He had, crucially, a letter he had received 3 days earlier from the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, responding to an inquiry he had filed in early May, clarifying that inherited homestead claims filed prior to the claimant's death remained valid for renewal by direct heirs for a period of 5 years, provided the heir filed formal notice of intent within that window. Sadie's letter from the Wichita Land Office had been precisely that notice. She had filed it in February, 4 months ago. The deadline Whitmore had just imposed was manufactured. It was illegal. And Noah now had a letter from the federal office that said so clearly enough to be unambiguous. He took the notice off the door and walked to his office and read the federal letter again, and then read Whitmore's notice against it with the slow, systematic attention of someone building a legal case in real time. And at the end of it, he folded both documents carefully into his breast pocket and walked out of his office and did not walk toward Whitmore's building, which was what Whitmore would be expecting. He walked toward the land registry office instead, arriving before it opened, and he stood in front of the door until Percival Dodge arrived with his key and said, "Good morning, Sheriff," in the particular tone of a man who expects the morning to be complicated. "Good morning, Percival," Noah said. "Open the door." Inside, the registry office had its usual smell of paper and ink and the particular dusty warmth of a room that kept its windows shut against the summer. Percival went to his desk and arranged his things with the nervous precision of his morning ritual. Noah stood at the front desk and placed the federal letter on it without speaking. Percival read it. The color changed in his face. "That is a federal clarification," Noah said, "which supersedes Commissioner Whitmore's administrative authority in matters of homestead inheritance. The Sullivan claim is valid. The 2-day redistribution notice is legally void." "Sheriff Hayes," Percival said, "the Commissioner has—" "I know what the Commissioner has," Noah said. "I am telling you what the Federal Land Commissioner in Topeka has. One of those two authorities outranks the other, and it is not Gerald Whitmore." Percival looked at the letter and then at Noah, and then at the door of his filing cabinet, and then back at Noah, performing a rapid internal calculation about futures and consequences. "If I add Miss Sullivan's claim without the Commissioner's authorization," he began, "then you will be in compliance with federal law," Noah said, "which protects you from any action the county commissioner might otherwise attempt. If you do not add it, the 2-day window Whitmore manufactured will expire, and Sadie Sullivan will lose land that federal law says is hers, and you will have been the mechanism of that theft. Those are the options, Percival. I want you to be very clear on what they are." More people had begun arriving at the registry office by then, the regular morning line of homesteaders and cattlemen and land buyers, filling up the narrow room and spilling out the door into the June heat. Percival looked at all of them and then at Noah, and then at the federal letter with an expression that had given up arguing and was simply calculating the least bad outcome. "She needs to be here to sign," he said finally, which was capitulation of a specific and useful kind. Noah reached the boarding house in 4 minutes and knocked with 3 sharp knocks, and Sadie came to the door with her hair half pinned and her breakfast coffee still in her hand because it was 8:44 in the morning, and she looked at his face and set the coffee down immediately. "What happened?" she said. He explained while she got her satchel. She was ready in less than 3 minutes, which told him something about the kind of woman she was that he had already known but was glad to have confirmed. She read the federal letter in her satchel while they walked, which was something he had not expected anyone could do and maintain their pace, but she managed it. "You sent this inquiry to Topeka 6 weeks ago," she said, not looking up from the letter. She stopped. "Before the 2nd week. The first day after you came to my office," he said. She did look up then, and the look on her face was layered in a way that he intended to think about later when there was time to do it properly. When they arrived at the registry office, the line was substantial. This was the moment. The moment that would later be retold in Caldwell in various versions, ranging from the embellished to the practically mythological, though the core of it remained the same in every telling, because the core of it was exactly what it was. Noah walked through the door with Sadie beside him and placed his hand flat on the registry desk and rattled the inkwell and looked at Percival Dodge with eyes that were doing no diplomatic work whatsoever and said, "Her name gets added before anyone else today." The silence in the room, the frozen line, Percival reaching for his pen with the movements of a man diffusing a situation rather than creating one. The scratch of pen on paper in that dusty, warm, ink-smelling room as Percival Dodge wrote Sadie Sullivan across a fresh line in the Caldwell Land Registry in the first hour of a Monday morning in June, 1879. Sadie stood beside Noah with her satchel on her shoulder and watched her name appear in ink in the official record of Caldwell County, and Noah watched her face, and what he saw there was not triumph, which he had expected, but something quieter and deeper and more permanent. She pressed her lips together once, which was the only visible crack in her composure, and then she reached over without looking at him and put her hand on his forearm, and he put his other hand over hers and held it. They had Sadie's signature witnessed and recorded, and the renewal papers properly stamped with the date and time before 9 o'clock. The federal letter was filed alongside it as supporting documentation. Percival made 3 copies, as was the regulation. Noah pocketed the receipt. Gerald Whitmore found out at approximately 9:30 when his informant in the registry office sent a message to his office, and he arrived at the registry at 9:45 with 2 men from his office staff flanking him, and the specific expression of a man who has not been thwarted in a very long time. He found Noah standing in the street outside the registry, which was not accidental. Noah had expected this. He had the receipt in his breast pocket and the federal letter on file inside, and the law arranged around him like a defense that Whitmore was going to have to be very creative to breach. "Hayes," Whitmore said, with a tight, controlled precision that was the closest he came to emotion in public, "I want to discuss this extraordinary breach of proper procedure." "You can discuss it with the federal land commissioner in Topeka," Noah said pleasantly, "since the Sullivan registration was made in compliance with federal statute, which is documented in the filing. Anything you wish to dispute will need to go through the federal level, not the county level." Whitmore stood in the June sun with his 2 office men and his tightly managed fury, and looked at Noah with the calculating attention of a man reconsidering a long-held assumption. "You have made an enemy today," he said, quietly enough that it was only for Noah's ears. "I have enforced the law today," Noah said, "which is what I was appointed to do." Whitmore held the look for one more moment, then turned and walked back toward his office with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who is restructuring a plan rather than abandoning a battle. Noah watched him go and felt the specific, sober alertness of someone who has won the first confrontation and knows the war is not finished. He went to find Sadie. She was at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house dining table with the stamped copy of her registration spread on the table before her, and she was not crying, because she was Sadie Sullivan, and she did not cry in ways that other people could observe. But her eyes were bright in a way that he recognized now as the specific brightness of emotion pressed back behind composure, and when he came through the door she looked up at him, and the composure slipped enough to show what was underneath it. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he confirmed, and sat across from her at the table. She looked at the registration for another moment, and then at him, and she said, "My father would have liked you enormously." And that undid something in Noah's chest that he had not known was still held tight. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, both of them with their hands extended across the space, and he said, "Sadie," and she said, "I know," and they sat there in Mrs. Calloway's bright dining room with the stamped registration between them and the June sun coming through the windows, and the thing they had not quite said yet filling up all the air in the room. What came next was Whitmore. Whitmore did not surrender. Careful men who have held power for a long time do not surrender a position because they have lost one engagement. They reassess. They find new leverage. And what Whitmore found, working with the precision of a man who had been doing exactly this for 2 decades, was that Noah Hayes had a potential vulnerability he had not yet used. Noah was a sheriff appointed by county authority, which meant Whitmore, as county commissioner, had a structural pathway to remove him. He could not do it on the grounds of the Sullivan registration, because the federal documentation made that legally untenable. But he could construct a case that Noah had overstepped his authority in other areas, had compromised the impartiality expected of his office by forming a personal attachment to a party in an open administrative matter, had acted outside his jurisdictional boundaries in filing a federal inquiry without county authorization. None of these were ironclad cases, but they were strong enough to occupy a sympathetic judge for long enough to create problems. Whitmore began making inquiries in early July, 2 weeks after the registration. Noah heard about it from the Caldwell judge, an honest man named Harding who had no love for Whitmore, but who came to Noah's office with the specific, apologetic look of someone delivering bad news in advance of its official arrival. Whitmore had filed a formal complaint with the county board requesting a review of Sheriff Hayes's conduct. The review would take place in 3 weeks. The board was composed of 5 members, 3 of whom owed Whitmore for various past favors. Noah sat with this information for one evening. He thought about his options the way he thought about every problem, slowly and from multiple angles, which was why he was good at his work. He thought about the fact that he could fight the review and probably lose and be removed, and then be unable to protect any future case that required the sheriff's authority. He thought about the fact that Sadie's claim was registered now, which was what had been most urgent, and that her land was secured. He thought about other things. Then he went to the boarding house and found Sadie on the porch and told her. She listened to the full explanation without interrupting him, because she was the kind of listener who understood that interruptions were a form of impatience, and that patience was a form of respect. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The July evening was thick and warm, the prairie stretching out in the last flat light, cicadas beginning their sound. "Whitmore is filing a conduct review," she said, "based on your involvement in my case." "Based on our personal association," Noah said, which was more accurate. Sadie looked at her hands in her lap and then at the middle distance of the prairie evening. "If I had not come to your office," she began. "Do not complete that sentence," he said, with a firmness that surprised them both slightly. If you had not come to my office, a federal law would have been violated, and you would have lost your inheritance, and I would have spent the rest of my career wondering why I had not done what I could to prevent it. I am not ambivalent about what I did. I am concerned about what it costs. It could cost you your position, she said. Yes, he said. Noah. She turned toward him with the particular directness that she only used when she was about to say something she had thought about completely. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, which I believe you are entirely capable of doing. Ask, he said. If you lose this review, she said, if Whitmore succeeds in removing you from this position, what do you have in Caldwell? The work is the center of your life here. If the work is taken, he thought about it honestly, which she had asked for. He thought about the office with the star above the door and the years he had put into making this particular piece of the frontier safer and more just, and the real grief that would come with losing it. And then he thought about the boarding house porch and the walk along the prairie edge and the Sunday on Millbrook Creek when he had kissed her in the wind, and the way the prospect of a life that contained Sadie Sullivan made the world reorganize itself into a shape that he could live in with something more than endurance. I have more than the work, he said. If you want to know. She met his eyes. Tell me, she said. I have you, he said, if you are willing to be had. It was the least elegant thing he had ever said and also the most accurate, and she looked at him for a moment with those Creekwater eyes that were very bright again. And then she laughed, which he had not quite heard before, a real laugh, full and clear, and she said, "That is the most practical declaration I have ever received." And he said, "I am a practical man," and she said, "I know," and leaned across the short distance of the porch and kissed him, softly and then less softly. And the July evening wrapped around them with its warmth and its vast sky and its smell of grass and distance. He fought the conduct review. He fought it the same way he did everything, with thorough preparation and a refusal to be theatrical about it. He spent 2 weeks assembling documentation of every action he had taken in the Sullivan case, matching each one to its statutory basis, demonstrating at each stage that the complaint's accusation of jurisdictional overreach was contradicted by the specific regulations governing a sheriff's authority to facilitate compliance with federal land law. Judge Harding, who was an honest man, agreed to hear the case as a neutral mediator between Noah and the county board. The hearing lasted 1 full day. Whitmore presented his complaint through a county attorney with a controlled expression and a well-organized argument that was, Noah conceded privately, not without its merits. Noah presented his statutory case without an attorney because he had reviewed the relevant material more thoroughly than any attorney in Caldwell County at that moment would have had time to, and because presenting it himself meant the board could see exactly how well he understood the ground he had been operating on. Sadie was in the back of the hearing room the entire day. She was not allowed to testify on his behalf because the personal association was the very thing in question, but she was present, which was enough. Every time Noah looked toward the back of the room, she was there with her straight spine and her folded hands and her composed, ferociously attentive expression, and it was, he later thought, exactly like having someone at your back who you knew would not move. The board deliberated for 2 hours. 3 of the 5 members were Whitmore's men, and Noah had not expected miracles. But Judge Harding's mediation had framed the question carefully enough that the 3 men could not vote for removal without explicitly endorsing Whitmore's violation of federal statute, which was a position none of them wanted on record. The compromise they reached was a formal censure rather than removal, a letter of criticism that would go into his official file, and that was, in the context of what Whitmore had been aiming for, a near-total failure of his strategy. Noah walked out of the hearing room in the late afternoon with the censure letter in his hand and found Sadie waiting on the steps outside, and he held up the letter in a way that communicated its nature clearly, and she read his face and said, "Censure." "Censure," he confirmed. "Not removal. Not removal." She was quiet for a moment, and then she put her hand on his arm, and then, because they were on the courthouse steps in full view of anyone on the main street of Caldwell, and she had apparently decided that this was beside the point. She put both arms around him and held on. He put his arms around her and held back, and they stood there on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon of a July day in 1879, while Caldwell went about its business around them, and he pressed his face briefly into her hair and breathed the specific scent of her, and felt the particular and profound relief of a man who has held the line and held it long enough. Whitmore did not try again. He was a patient man, but he was also a calculating one, and the federal involvement had changed the calculus of the Sullivan land irrevocably. Pursuing it further would require escalating his exposure at precisely the moment when Judge Harding was watching his conduct with heightened attention. He redirected his energies toward other opportunities and other parcels, which was the thing about men like Whitmore that was both a relief and an ongoing sorrow, because there were always other parcels, and there was only ever one of him and one Noah Hayes, and the math of injustice did not favor the just. But the Sullivan land was safe, and Sadie's name was in the registry, and Gerald Whitmore, for the time being, had been made to understand the shape of what he was dealing with. Noah proposed on a Sunday in August, which was 4 months after Sadie had climbed out of that broken stagecoach, and 12 weeks after she had put her hand over his on a boarding house porch. And he did it on the Sullivan land north of Millbrook Creek, because it was hers, and it was beginning to be his, in the way that things you love become yours by attention and by care. They had ridden out on the Sunday afternoon to survey the land properly, to plan where the house would sit relative to the creek and the prevailing wind, where a barn might go, how the natural slope of the ground could be used to keep spring water from collecting against a foundation. Sadie had a notebook and was making precise sketches, and Noah was kneeling in the grass examining the soil quality with the focused interest of a man who grew up understanding that soil was the basis of everything, and the afternoon was the particular gold of August in Kansas, everything burnished and warm and smelling of late summer. He stood up and looked at her, and she was drawing the line of the creek in her notebook with complete absorption, and the sunlight was in her hair, and the 15-mile view opened out in every direction. And he thought about her father saying it felt like being able to see clearly, and he thought about a future that looked like this particular quality of clarity and warmth and the presence of this particular woman, and the thought was so simple and so solid that it needed no preparation. "Sadie," he said. She looked up from her notebook. "Marry me," he said, not with ceremony, because he was a man who did not dress things up when the truth was cleaner undressed. "Marry me and build this with me and let me be here every morning of the rest of your life." She closed the notebook slowly. The grass moved around them in a long, slow wave from the south. The creek ran below. The sky went on and on. "I have been managing alone for a long time," she said, which was not a no, was in fact the specific shape of a woman telling a man exactly what vulnerability she was overcoming in order to say yes. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to stop being yourself. I am asking you to be yourself alongside me." She looked at him with those eyes that saw things clearly, and then she said, "Yes, Noah Hayes," with a directness that matched his own and was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He crossed the grass to her and kissed her the way he had been wanting to kiss her since the boarding house porch, with intention and without reserve, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, and the August afternoon held them in its golden warmth on the land that was hers and would be theirs. They were married in Caldwell's small Methodist church on the first Saturday of September, 1879, in a service conducted by the white-bearded minister who had shared Sadie's stagecoach, and who presided with the particular pleasure of a man who knew he was officiating over something that had been earned. Mrs. Calloway attended and wept pleasurably. Judge Harding attended and did not weep but smiled throughout with the reserved satisfaction of an honest man watching a just conclusion. Percival Dodge attended, which surprised both Noah and Sadie slightly, and stood in the back with an expression of obscure relief that Noah interpreted as the look of a man who is glad to have been, in the end, on the right side of a particular piece of history. Whitmore did not attend, which surprised no one. The church was simple and the congregation was modest, and the service was not long, because Noah and Sadie had agreed, when discussing the wedding with the minister, that what needed to be said between them had mostly been said already in registries and on prairie grass and on porch steps in the evening, and that what remained to be said was the specific, formal, public version, which they said clearly and meant completely. When the minister asked if Noah Hayes took this woman, Noah said yes with the voice he used for things he was absolutely certain of, which was very like his ordinary voice, but with a bedrock quality beneath it that people who knew him recognized as the voice of his most fundamental commitments. When the minister asked if Sadie Sullivan took this man, Sadie looked at Noah directly and said yes with such clear, unambiguous steadiness that Mrs. Calloway's happy weeping increased noticeably. They were married at noon on a September Saturday, and by early afternoon they were walking the main street of Caldwell as Noah and Sadie Hayes, and the September sun was doing its best, and the cattle were moving on the trail beyond the edge of town, and the Kansas sky was enormous and clear, and Noah held his wife's hand, and she held his, and they walked in the particular way of people who have found the thing they were looking for and know it absolutely. They built the house on the Sullivan land that autumn, and it took longer than they planned because a man cannot both sheriff a town and frame a house simultaneously without certain compromises to the schedule of each. But by November there were 4 walls and a roof, and a fieldstone fireplace that Noah laid himself with the focused care of a man building something intended to last multiple generations. Sadie hung curtains in December and bought a cast iron stove in the same month, and the house became, with the particular alchemy of a woman who knows how to make a space into a home, a real place that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the clean cold of the Kansas winter. Noah continued as sheriff of Caldwell through the winter and into the following year. The censure in his file was a mark, but it had not diminished him in the eyes of Caldwell's honest citizens, and the ones whose estimation he most valued were, in fact, the more firmly on his side for knowing what it had cost him. He was better at his work with Sadie behind him, which was not something he had anticipated. He had thought that love would be a softening, a distraction. Instead, it was a foundation. You could stand more steadily on firm ground. Gerald Whitmore's position in Caldwell began to erode the following spring, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, patient work of Judge Harding's ongoing scrutiny and 2 federal investigations that had been quietly initiated as a consequence of the documentation Noah had filed in the Sullivan case. By 1881, Whitmore had resigned his commissionership amid a formal inquiry into his land redistribution practices and moved to Denver, which was not justice fully achieved but was justice proceeding, which was often how justice actually worked. Noah and Sadie watched him go without ceremony. They had their land and their house and their life, and that was its own sufficient completion. Their son James was born in the spring of 1881, named for Sadie's father, delivered in the house on the Sullivan land by Mrs. Calloway, who proved to have considerable practical expertise in the matter. Noah sat outside the bedroom door through the long hours of the labor with his hands folded, and his jaw tight and his ordinary composure stretched to its exact limit. And when Mrs. Calloway opened the door and said, "Sheriff, you have a son," he had crossed the room and been at Sadie's side before the words had fully resolved in the air. She was tired and pale and fiercely, triumphantly alive, and she put the small wrapped bundle that was James Sullivan Hayes into Noah's arms with the deliberate care of someone transferring something of supreme value, and he held his son for the first time and felt every hard, solitary, carefully maintained distance of the previous decade simply cease to exist. He was, quite completely, undone in the best possible way. "He has your eyes," Sadie said from the pillow, watching him. Noah looked at the small, rumpled, sleeping face and then at Sadie with a look that he made no effort to contain. "He has your jaw," he said. "He is going to be stubborn." "He has your jaw," she said serenely. "He is going to be stubborn and righteous about it." He laughed. It was the specific laugh of a man who has more happiness in his chest than he knows what to do with. Little James grew into a sturdy, quick-minded child who was given to sitting with intense focus and then moving with sudden decision, which both of his parents recognized as a trait that had come from both sides of the family equally. He learned to walk on the Sullivan land in the summer of 1882, taking his first independent steps across the kitchen floor of the house his father had built, reaching from the leg of the table toward his mother's outstretched hands with the absolute concentrated courage of a very small person attempting something enormous. Sadie worked the land through those years with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything. She was not a romantic about farming. She had read everything she could find about dryland farming practices before she arrived in Caldwell, and she had continued reading and adapting through the dry years and the wet years and the seasons that made no promises. She grew winter wheat and kept a kitchen garden and raised chickens, and by 1883 the Sullivan land was producing steadily and feeding its family and generating a modest return on the work they put into it. She also, beginning in the fall of 1882, started a small school in the front room of the house 2 mornings a week for the children of the families who had settled in the surrounding acres, because the nearest school was 4 miles away, and 4 miles was a long walk for a 6-year-old in January. The front room school grew. By 1884, it had 8 students and had outgrown the front room, and Noah, who had spent his evenings for the previous month measuring the eastern side of the property for a suitable addition, broke ground on a separate 1-room schoolhouse in April of that year. He built it with help from 3 neighboring farmers who understood the value of it to their own children, and who gave their labor willingly for the materials Noah provided. And when it was finished in June, Sadie stood in the doorway of the new building and looked at the 12 small desks Noah had made, and the blackboard he had mounted, and the windows that faced east for the morning light. And her face had the particular brightness that he knew was the pressed-back version of emotion she had not yet released. "You built me a school," she said. "You built a school," he said. "I built you a building." She turned from the doorway and looked at him with the full force of her regard, which after 5 years of marriage still had the quality of something that could stop him completely in the middle of whatever else he was doing. "Noah Hayes," she said. "Sadie Hayes," he said. She crossed the short distance between them and put her hands on his face and kissed him in the doorway of the schoolhouse on the Sullivan land in the June afternoon, and he put his arms around her and held her in the particular way he had found, over years of practice, that fit the specific shape of her perfectly, and that she leaned into with the complete and trusting weight of a woman who is entirely, unconditionally home. In 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, for no one in particular, but because it was a name that felt like clarity, which felt appropriate for the daughter of these 2 specific people. Clara arrived in January, a winter baby, smaller than James had been, but with a pair of lungs that established themselves immediately as a force to be reckoned with, and a pair of green eyes that were precisely her mother's color, and were open and examining the ceiling of the bedroom, with that same assessing attention within what felt like minutes of her arrival. James, who was 4 and had been prepared for a sibling with the same thoroughness that Sadie brought to all educational endeavors, regarded his new sister with the careful, serious attention of a child who takes new information very seriously, and then appointed himself her primary protector, a role he maintained with considerable dedication through the years that followed. Noah expanded the ranch in 1886. He had, through the years of building and farming, come to understand land the way a man understands a language he has been learning by living in it rather than by studying it. And the 160 acres of the original Sullivan claim had become, through purchase from neighboring homesteaders who were leaving for Colorado and California. 220 acres of mixed grassland and wheat field that sat in the gentle curve of Millbrook Creek like something that had always been meant to be there. He also resigned as sheriff of Caldwell in the autumn of 1886. It was not a decision made in anger or defeat, but in the steady recognition that the center of his life had moved. Caldwell had a new generation of citizens coming in, and new problems that wanted a younger man's energy and attention. And the work that needed Noah most was the work on the Sullivan land and in the schoolhouse, and in the home that he and Sadie had made from the ground up. He turned the badge over to a capable deputy named Patterson with a briefing that covered every situation Patterson was likely to encounter and a few he was not, and walked out of the office with the star above the door for the last time on a November afternoon, and rode home with the particular lightness of a man who has completed one chapter and is ready for what comes next. He was 38. Sadie was 33. James was 5, beginning to read with the absorbed focus that suggested his mother's school teaching had found its most attentive student. Clara was 10 months old and had just begun to stand by holding the furniture and looking around with an expression of tactical assessment that made her parents exchange private, delighted looks above her head. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was a hard one. The cold came early and drove deep into the Kansas ground with a ferocity that was almost personal, and Noah and Sadie moved through those months with the efficient, practiced collaboration of two people who have learned to work in true partnership, not divided labor but shared labor, each one doing whatever the moment required without regard for whose job it technically was. Noah cooked on mornings when Sadie was dealing with a sick child. Sadie repaired a fence section in February when Noah's hands were full with a heifer who had chosen the coldest week of the year to calve. They moved through the winter like a single organism with two very capable brains, and by spring they were still standing and the land was still intact, and the calves were alive, and the children were healthy, and the school had resumed its twice-weekly sessions with 12 students. On a March evening of 1887, when the first warmth of the approaching spring was beginning to make a tentative argument against the remaining cold, Noah and Sadie sat together at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. The fire was low and comfortable in the fieldstone fireplace. Outside, the Kansas night was quiet. The lamp made a warm circle on the oilcloth of the table and on the 2 cups of coffee between them, and Sadie had her elbows on the table and was looking at Noah with the expression she got when she was thinking about something she was working toward saying. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about a Tuesday in April," she said, "when a stagecoach broke its wheel outside Harmon's General Store." He smiled, and the smile was the kind that had taken him years to arrive at, the easy, unguarded kind that lived on his face now in a way it had not when he was a man made entirely of duty and solitude. "You climbed out of that coach like you owned the street," he said. "I was terrified," she said. He looked at her. "You were not." "I was," she said, and she was entirely serious. "I had 2 years of savings and a letter and a claim that I did not know was already under threat. I was a woman alone in an unfamiliar town with everything riding on whether the institutions of that town were going to treat me fairly. I was frightened every day for the first 2 weeks. He thought about this. He thought about the composure and the directness and the precise, careful arguments and the way she had held herself in that registry office and in his own office, and in the confrontations with Percival and the day-by-day endurance of the denials, and he thought about what it would take to produce that performance while carrying fear underneath it, and his regard for her increased in a way he had not thought had room to increase further. "You did not show it," he said. "I could not afford to," she said. "Frightened women get managed. Competent women get taken seriously. I knew which one I needed to be." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had on that boarding house porch on the first evening, the gesture that had started everything. "You were both," he said. You were frightened and competent at the same time, and you came to my office anyway, and you fought for 8 weeks and you never stopped. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen, Sadie, and I have seen a great many things." She turned her hand under his and held it. The fire settled in the grate. The March wind moved around the outside of the house that he had built and she had made into a home. "I would have lost it without you," she said. "You would have found another way," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "But I found you, and you found me, and I am not interested in the version without you." She said it with the matter-of-fact simplicity that was her specific style of saying the things that meant the most. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, which was not a gesture he made often, and the rarity of it made it land with more weight than any number of more practiced declarations. She watched him do it with the expression she wore when she was very still inside, when the thing happening was being received completely. "I was alone for 10 years, he said, with his mouth still near her hand. "And then you climbed out of a broken stagecoach on a Tuesday afternoon, and everything I had been telling myself about being satisfied with my life stopped being convincing." He looked up at her. "I did not know what I was missing until you showed up and it became obvious." She reached across with her free hand and touched his face, his jaw, the corner of his mouth, with the careful, deliberate tenderness of someone who does not take the thing she loves for granted. "Sheriff Hayes," she said softly. "Former sheriff," he said. "Always sheriff to me," she said, and smiled, which he still found capable of undoing something in the center of his chest every single time, because it was a smile she gave rarely and completely, with nothing held back. He came around the table, and she rose to meet him, and he held her in the warm kitchen of the house on the Sullivan land with the fire low and the children sleeping and the Kansas night around them. And they stood there for a long time, just that, holding each other in the quiet center of the life they had built from a broken stagecoach and a contested land claim and a registry book, and the specific, unlikely, irreversible decision of two people to trust each other in the middle of a fight. Their second son, William, was born in the autumn of 1888, and he arrived red-faced and already announcing himself as someone who intended to be heard. James, who was 7 by then, took the arrival with the magnanimous patience of an eldest child who has already processed this experience once and considers himself an authority. Clara, who was 3 and had her mother's green eyes and her father's decisive way of moving through the world, was deeply interested in the new baby and required supervision in her interest, as her version of it tended toward the hands-on. The schoolhouse on the Sullivan land continued through the years, and by 1890 had grown to accommodate 20 students and a second teacher, a young woman from Wichita named Ruth who had answered the advertisement Sadie had placed in the Wichita paper, with the same directness and thoroughness that she had once brought to her own arrival in Caldwell. Sadie and Ruth divided the classes by age, and Sadie continued to teach the older children while managing the ranch's books and the household and the production of the wheat fields with the organizational efficiency of someone who had always simply assumed she would find a way to do everything that needed doing. Noah farmed. He had become, in the decade since he had broken the Sullivan land's first season of wheat, a good farmer, which was a different kind of good than being a good sheriff, less about containment and more about cultivation, but the underlying quality was the same: patience, attention, willingness to be present with a situation as it actually was rather than as it might be ideally constructed. He was, his neighbors had come to say, the steadiest hand in their part of the county, which was the same thing people had said about him in Caldwell, and which was the deepest truth about Noah Hayes that the world kept finding ways to express. He was also, in the private and specific and entirely sufficient life of the house on the Sullivan land, a man in love with his wife in the way that people are in love after a decade together, which is not the breathless and destabilizing love of the beginning, but something built into the very structure of daily existence, present in the morning and the evening and the middle of ordinary days, woven through the fabric of everything so that pulling it out would not leave a hole, but would unravel the whole cloth. He looked at Sadie across the breakfast table in the mornings and felt it. He felt it watching her teach a child who was struggling, with that patient, tireless attention she brought to the work of learning. He felt it on evenings when she sat near the lamp with a book and her hair loose around her shoulders and her feet curled under her on the chair, and the firelight was on her face, and she was somewhere inside a story that he could only observe from the outside, and the existence of her in the room was enough, was more than enough, was in fact everything. He had been, before her, a man who lived at the edge of his own life, doing the work and performing the function, and maintaining the necessary distance from the interior things he was afraid might not be there if he looked directly at them. She had made him look, had made it safe to look, and what he had found was that the interior things were there, and were, in fact, the best parts of him. On a June evening in 1892, 13 years after a broken stagecoach wheel had set two particular lives into collision, Noah Hayes sat on the wide porch of the house on the Sullivan land and watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie in that extravagant, showing-off way that the Kansas sky had in summer. James was 14 and had recently announced his intention to study law, which had made his mother's eyes very bright with a pride she did not press back on that particular occasion, but let arrive completely on her face. Clara was 11 and was already teaching the youngest students in Sadie's school with a natural authority that had her mother's precision and her father's quiet force. William was 3 and was in the yard at the edge of the porch, building something with rocks that he was explaining to no one in particular in a stream of confident, largely incomprehensible commentary. Sadie came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside Noah on the porch bench, which was the wide, solid bench he had built 4 years ago specifically to accommodate 2 people sitting close together in the evenings, and gave him his cup and tucked herself against his side, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the Kansas sunset, and listened to William's authoritative monologue about his rock construction and the distant sound of James and Clara disagreeing about something in the house behind them. The 15-mile view from the Sullivan land opened out ahead of them in the evening light, the grass going gold and the creek catching the last of the sun below the ridge, the sky enormous and beginning to show its first stars at the eastern edge. See clearly, her father had said. Feel like being able to see clearly. What are you thinking? Sadie said. That your father chose well, Noah said. She looked at the view and then up at the first stars and then at his face. He did, she said quietly, and he was not entirely sure she was still talking about the land. He pressed his mouth to her temple and she closed her eyes and leaned in, and William continued his geological monologue in the yard, and the Kansas evening spread out around them in all directions, vast and full of stars, and the house behind them was full of the life they had made, and the land ahead of them was the promise her father had made to the future, and standing on it you could see everything, clearly, 15 miles in every direction, which was as close as any of us get to seeing the whole of what matters. The registry book in Caldwell still had Sadie Sullivan's name on the first line of that Monday morning in June, 1879. Percival Dodge had written it in his small, careful hand, and the ink had not faded. The date was precise and official, and the renewal fee was documented and stamped, and the whole thing was legally unassailable and complete. Years later, when James was studying law in Topeka and asked his father about the case as a legal matter, Noah had described it in the specific, methodical terms of statutory compliance and federal supersession, and James had listened carefully and made notes, and then said quietly, the way his father sometimes said things, "You did it for her." Noah had looked at his son, who had Sadie's eyes in Noah's face, and said, "I did it because the law required it." James had looked at him with the particular, knowing patience of a person who grew up observing 2 people in love with each other for his entire life, and therefore understood what it looked like from the inside. "Yes," James said, "and also for her." Noah had been quiet for a moment. Then he said yes, and also for her. James had gone back to his notes with the small, private smile of a young man who is glad his parents are the people they are. And Noah had sat at the kitchen table of the house on the Sullivan land and thought about a Tuesday in April when a stagecoach broke its wheel and a woman with green eyes climbed out and looked at Caldwell, Kansas, with the clear, assessing gaze of someone who was going to find what she came for. She had found it. He had found it. They had found it together, in the particular and irreversible way of things that are found once and kept forever, on the land north of Millbrook Creek, where you could stand and see for 15 miles in every direction and everything was clear.